Urina had scrubbed the stone floors of the Volchia fortress for 643 days when she found the king drowning in his own blood beneath the shattered ice of the Chorna River. And the moment her fingers closed over the frost-blackened wound above his heart, she recognized the mark carved into it. The same crescent and fang pattern her dead father had etched into a wolf-bone pendant 11 years before he was executed as a traitor. If you have ever been underestimated by every single person who was supposed to protect you, comment below where you're watching this from right now, and hit subscribe before the ice cracks any further, because what happens next will make Voivode Branimir Kostrov reject the noblewoman his court already crowned in his name. She was not supposed to be near the river at all. Servants of her rank, war captive rank, the lowest rank, the rank that came with a collar of gray wool sewn to mark her as property of Drevislava's conquered, were forbidden past the tanning sheds after the 7th bell. But the laundry basins had frozen solid, and Urina had learned in 11 years of servitude that frozen basins meant a walk to the spring-fed bend of the Chorna, where the current stayed just warm enough to thaw wool without a fire. She carried 2 buckets and a paring knife she was not permitted to own, hidden in the lining of her boot, and she was 300 paces from the fortress wall when she heard the wet, tearing sound of something enormous breaking through river ice from beneath. The wolf that surfaced was the size of a war horse, its flank opened by a wound too clean to be from claws or teeth, its silver-black fur matted with something darker than water. It dragged itself onto the frost-crusted bank and began, in halting, shuddering pulses, to fold back into the shape of a man, a huge man, unconscious before the change even finished, his ribs visible where the wound had eaten through muscle, his face turned toward the moon with an expression of total, animal helplessness that Urina had never once seen on the face of anyone with a title. She should have run. Every rule beaten into her since the day Drevislava fell said that a servant who touched a lord uninvited, especially an unconscious one, especially one bleeding out on sovereign land, would be flayed before the sun rose twice. But her father had been a battlefield healer before he was called traitor and killed for it, and some reflex older than fear made her drop the buckets, kneel in the mud, and press both palms hard against the wound, the way he had taught her when she was 7 years old, and thought healing was a kind of magic instead of a kind of stubbornness. The blood did not merely flow, it was tinged with a sick, silvery sheen that caught the moonlight wrong, and when Urina touched her tongue to her wrist afterward, an old habit of her father's, checking for the bitter note of certain poisons, she tasted iron and something else beneath it, something like burnt hair and crushed nightshade. Wolfsbane, refined past its natural bitterness into something almost sweet. Someone had poisoned this man before the wound was ever made, so that his body, mid-transformation, would be too weak to heal itself. That was Loop A, and it would not close for a long time yet. Someone inside the Volchia court had engineered this man's near death, and they were patient enough, and close enough to him, to have done it twice already, without anyone noticing the pattern. Urina packed the wound with river moss and the crushed inner bark of a willow she stripped with her forbidden knife, exactly as her father's ledgers had described treating silver blight poisoning in soldiers during the war. She worked for what felt like an hour, humming without meaning to, the same tuneless 3 notes her father used to hum over dying men, until the wound's edges stopped weeping silver and started, slowly, knitting themselves into something that looked survivable. Only then did she notice the pendant. It had slipped from beneath the unconscious man's collar during the change, a small carved disc of yellowed bone on a leather cord, etched with a crescent moon, pierced by a single fang. Urina's whole body went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the river. She owned an identical pendant, hidden inside the false bottom of the wooden comb box she'd smuggled out of Drevislava the night her father was killed. 2 objects, carved by the same hand, on the necks of 2 people who should never have had any reason to know each other. That was the first thread of Loop C, though Urina had no way yet to understand what it meant, only that her hands were shaking for reasons that had stopped being about the cold. She did not know, kneeling in the mud with a stranger's blood drying black under her fingernails, that the man she had just saved was Voivode Branimir Kostrov, sovereign of the Volchia pack, ruler of every wolf-blooded clan between the Chorna River and the black spine of the Severa Mountains, the same man whose court she had scrubbed floors for since the day Drevislava's walls came down. She only knew that he breathed easier when she pressed the willow poultice flat, that his hand, when it closed around her wrist in a moment of half-conscious panic, was enormous and scarred and shook like a much smaller man's, and that when his eyes opened for 3 full seconds, before he lost consciousness again, they were the pale gold of a wolf's, and then, impossibly, they darkened to near black as something like recognition crossed his face, recognition of the pendant at her collar, not of her. By the time 2 of his guard found them at dawn, Yarina had dragged him as far up the bank as her strength allowed, built a fire from driftwood with flint stolen years ago and never used, and sat through the coldest hours of her life with her hands pressed to a king's chest, counting his heartbeats, because counting was the only thing keeping her from screaming. The guards did not thank her. They dragged her back to the fortress by the collar, accused her of attempted regicide by poison, because what servant simply happens to be riverside at the exact hour the sovereign nearly drowns, and threw her into the lower cells to await the return of Lady Zorana Krivaya, the noblewoman the court had all but crowned as the voivode's chosen mate, who was 3 days out on a hunting circuit and would, everyone assured Yarina with real relish, decide personally how a servant who dared touch the sovereign's bare skin should be punished. That was Loop B, and its first thread was a promise made through the cell bars by a steward named Ilya Rostock, who leaned close enough that Yarina could smell the mead on his breath, and told her, almost gently, that Lady Zorana had once ordered a stable hand's tongue removed for saying her hounds smelled worse than the kennel. So imagine, he said, what she'd do to a war slave who'd had her bare hands on the voivode's chest while he was unconscious and unable to consent to being touched by something like her. Yarina spent 3 days in a cell with no window, rationing a heel of bread she'd hidden in her sleeve, running her thumb over the ridges of her father's pendant, which she had thought to grab from the comb box before the guards dragged her out. Some instinct telling her that if this was going to be the end of things, she wanted it near her. She did not cry. 11 years of servitude had taught her that crying changed nothing, except how much energy she had left to survive the next indignity, and she intended to survive this one too, even if she didn't yet know how. If you're the kind of person who's had to stay calm while everyone around you decided your fate without asking your name, comment the word river below, because Yarina is about to walk into a room full of people who think they already know how this ends. On the 4th morning, the cell door opened not to guards, but to the voivode himself, upright, pale, moving like a man 3 weeks recovered rather than 3 days, with 2 attendants trailing a half-step behind him and an expression that made even the hardened jailer step back. He did not speak to the guards. He looked directly at Yarina, seated on the cold floor in her gray wool collar, and said her name, her actual name, Yarina, not servant or war trash, or any of the words the court usually used, which meant someone had told him, or he had asked, and either possibility terrified her more than the cell had. "You packed Silverblight wound with willow bark and river moss," he said, not a question. "In the correct sequence. In the correct proportion. Where does a laundry servant learn the correct proportion for treating wolfsbane poisoning refined past its natural threshold?" Yarina considered lying. 11 years had taught her that competence, in a captive, was often more dangerous than ignorance. But something about the pendant at his collar, visible now, deliberately worn outside his shirt where it had been hidden before, made her tell the truth instead. "My father was a battlefield healer for Drevislava," she said. "Before your court executed him for treason, he did not commit." The voivode's jaw tightened at that, a small thing, but Yarina had spent a lifetime reading the small things on the faces of people who could destroy her, and she saw something that looked almost like recognition of a debt he didn't yet understand he owed. "Show me the pendant you wear," he said, instead of responding to the accusation, and when Yarina drew it from beneath her collar with hands she could not fully steady, the voivode went utterly still, in a way that had nothing to do with weakness, and everything to do with a memory surfacing faster than he could control it. "My mother wore this same mark," he said quietly, "before she was murdered 19 years ago, for the crime of loving a Drevoslavan healer instead of the Volchia lord her father chose for her. That was the moment Loop C truly opened, though neither of them could yet see its full shape. That Irina's executed father and the voivode's murdered mother had shared a bond the two kingdoms had gone to war, partly to erase the memory of, and that the pendant carved twice by the same hand was not decoration, but a claim, proof of an old alliance between a hidden line of Dravoslavan healers and the Volchia royal blood, an alliance someone inside this very court had killed twice already to keep buried. He ordered her released from the cell that same hour, over the visible fury of the steward Ilya Rostock, and assigned her, to the horror of the entire court, as his personal healer, a position with rank, quarters, and protection, effective immediately. It should have felt like victory. Instead, word reached the fortress by dusk that Lady Zorana Krivaya had cut her hunting circuit short and was 3 hours from the gates. Here's a real question for you before we go further. If you found out the person everyone told you to fear was coming home early, specifically because of you, would you run, or would you stay and finish what you started? Type your answer below, because Irina chose to stay, and it cost her almost everything. Lady Zorana arrived exactly as described, golden-haired, ice-eyed, dressed in furs that had never once touched mud, and found Irina in the sovereign's healing chambers, changing a dressing on his ribs, with the calm precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Zorana's laugh, when it came, was the kind designed to be heard by an entire hallway. "They pulled you out of the drowning cells to play physician," she said, circling Irina slowly, close enough that Irina could smell crushed juniper and something colder underneath it. "Tell me, River Rat, did they also forget to mention that servants who touch royal skin without permission lose the hand that did the touching? Or were you too busy fishing a king out of the water to remember what you are?" "What I am," Irina said, keeping her hands perfectly steady on the dressing, "is the only person in this fortress who noticed he was being poisoned twice before you decided to come home and ask questions." The silence that followed was total. Zorana's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes did, a flicker Irina recognized from years of reading dangerous people. Not offense, but calculation, the look of someone realizing an accusation had landed closer to true than they expected. "Careful," Zorana said softly, close enough now that only Irina could hear it. "Accusing your betters of things you cannot prove is how river rats end up back in the river." That threat, how river rats end up back in the river, would return, inverted, in less than 3 weeks, though Irina did not yet know it, and neither did the audience, who would one day hear it thrown back across an arena floor. Over the following days, as her body finished healing and her strength returned in full, Voivode Branimir Kostrov did something the entire court found more alarming than the healer appointment. He began, deliberately and in front of witnesses, treating Irina with a formality he extended to no one below noble rank. He stood when she entered a room. He asked her opinion on matters of poison and treatment in council, matters she answered with a precision that embarrassed 3 court physicians in a single afternoon. He assigned Boyar Casimir Drazul, the court's senior advisor, a man whose smiling patience Irina would come to understand far too late was itself a mask, to personally investigate the source of the wolfsbane found in the voivode's blood. It was Casimir who suggested, with apparent reluctance, that the investigation be widened to include the servant quarters, since, he said, spreading his hands in a show of regret, poisoners rarely worked entirely alone, and a war captive with unusual medical knowledge and unsupervised access to the kitchens was, however unfortunate to consider, a name that had to be examined. Irina understood, watching him say it, exactly what kind of man Casimir Drazul was. She understood it too late to stop what came next. If you've ever watched someone smile at you while quietly building the case that will destroy you, you already know what this feels like, and I promise you the reveal is worth staying for. Hit that subscribe button now, so you don't miss how Irina turns this exact accusation back on the man who built it. The formal accusation came 8 days later. Irina, war captive of Dravoslava, charged with the attempted poisoning of Voivode Branimir Kostrov, sovereign of the Volchia pack, the evidence being a vial of concentrated wolfsbane extract discovered, planted, though no one but Irina, and, she suspected, Casimir himself knew that, inside the false bottom of her own smuggled comb box, the very box that had once hidden her father's pendant. Slavic law regarding accusations against a sovereign's health permitted only one form of resolution, when the accused held no noble blood to demand a formal council trial. Ritual combat, in the sunken stone arena beneath the fortress, witnessed by the full assembled pack, the accused fighting a champion of the court's choosing, the outcome treated as the judgment of the old gods rather than the judgment of men. Lady Zorana volunteered her own personal guard captain as champion within the hour, a woman named Fyodra, who had killed 11 opponents in ritual combat and never once lost. Branimir refused to allow it. He argued in front of the full council that the accusation was engineered, that he himself had watched Yarina heal him at the cost of her own safety, that the timing of the vial's discovery, mere hours after Casimir's suggestion to search the servant quarters, was itself suspicious. But Slavic law on this point was absolute even for a sovereign. Once ritual combat was formally invoked by an accuser of sufficient rank, only the arena could overturn it. And Branimir's own weakened, still healing body meant he could not stand as her champion without the council declaring him unfit to rule, a declaration Casimir Drazul was visibly, hungrily ready to push for. Yarina made the decision herself, in the end. She stood before the full council in her gray wool collar, her father's pendant, now worn openly at her throat by Branimir's own order, and said she would fight for herself, because she had spent 11 years being decided for, and she would not let this be the 12th. She trained for 6 days with the only person willing to teach her in secret, an old wolf-blooded groundskeeper named Bogdan, once a war scout for the Volchia pack, before an injury retired him, who recognized in Yarina's stance the exact economical brutality her father had once shown him, treating soldiers on a battlefield decades ago, a debt Bogdan had apparently been waiting his whole life to repay. The training itself left bruises. Yarina counted every night by candlelight, 17 the first evening, 23 by the fourth, each one a lesson she refused to let herself forget. Bogdan did not teach her strength, because strength was the one thing 11 years of servitude and 1 afternoon of ritual combat could never give her against a woman twice her size. He taught her weight distribution instead, the precise angle at which a smaller body could turn a larger opponent's own momentum into a weapon, the half-second window that opened whenever an overconfident fighter chose to humiliate instead of finish. He made her practice the same wrist lock 40 times an hour until her hands ached worse than her bruises, until the motion stopped living in her mind and started living in her tendons instead, where fear couldn't reach it. On the 5th night, when Yarina finally executed the lock fast enough to disarm him outright, Bogdan sat down hard on the frozen ground and said nothing for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rougher than usual. He told her that her father had done something almost identical to a Volchia raider 20 years earlier, on a battlefield Bogdan himself had been bleeding out on, and that the raider had lived because Yarina's father chose mercy over a kill he was owed by every law of war. Bogdan had never forgotten the healer's face. He had spent 2 decades wondering if the debt would ever come due, and here, at the end of it, was the healer's daughter, learning the exact same restraint in reverse. That's 40% of this story closed, and here's what's still open. Who actually poisoned Branimir, whether the pendant truly proves an alliance old enough to end a war, and whether Yarina survives the arena at all. Comment arena if you think she wins clean, or trick if you think the fight itself is another trap. I read every single one of these. The morning of the ritual combat, Casimir Drazul visited Yarina's quarters under the pretense of offering her a final meal as courtesy demanded, and in doing so, made his only true mistake. He could not resist telling her, quietly, that Fyodra's blade would be dulled just enough at the tip to guarantee a slow kill rather than a quick one, so the court could watch the war slave's arrogance bleed out properly in front of everyone, a detail he would have no reason to know unless he had personally arranged the blade himself. Yarina said nothing in response. She simply remembered every word, the way her father had taught her to remember the exact dosage of every poison she was ever shown, because someday the details always mattered. The arena beneath the fortress held 900 witnesses that afternoon, seated on frost-slicked stone tiers, carved 4 centuries earlier, for exactly this purpose. Lady Zorana sat in the front row, beside Casimir Drazul, both of them radiating the particular calm of people certain of an outcome. Branimir sat 2 seats away, forbidden by law from intervening once combat began, his knuckles white against the stone armrest. Fyodra entered first, 7 feet of scarred muscle in Volchia war leather, her blade exactly as promised, dulled at the tip in a way only someone who'd handled 100 combat blades would notice, which Yarina now was. Yarina entered wearing her gray wool collar for the last time, her father's pendant tucked inside her shirt against her skin, and Bogdan's 6 days of brutal economical teaching in every line of her stance. The duel lasted 4 minutes that felt, to everyone watching, like an hour. Fyodra was faster and vastly stronger, and for the first 2 minutes, she drove Yarina backward, across the frozen stone, with the confident cruelty of someone who had never once needed to try. But Yarina had spent 11 years learning to survive people stronger than her by understanding exactly how they thought, and she had spent 6 days learning that Fyodra's dulled blade meant Fyodra herself expected a slow, showy kill rather than an efficient one, meant Fyodra would extend the fight rather than end it, would toy before she finished. In the 3rd minute, when Fyodra lowered her guard for exactly the half-second required to deliver a humiliating theatrical blow rather than a killing one, Yarina used the opening Bogdan had drilled into her 100 times, stepped inside Fyodra's reach where the size advantage meant nothing, and disarmed her with a wrist lock that ended, cleanly, with Fyodra's own blade at Fyodra's own throat. The arena went utterly silent. "Yield," Yarina said, loud enough for all 900 witnesses to hear, "and tell them whose orders dulled your blade." Fyodra yielded, and in front of the full assembled pack, humiliated and afraid, she named Casimir Drazul as the man who had personally handed her the weapon that morning, with explicit instructions on how slowly the war slave should die. That's 70% closed. The duel is won, the blade is exposed, but Loop A is still wide open, because a dulled blade explains today's cruelty, not the wolfsbane that nearly killed Branimir twice, and Loop C hasn't given up its secret yet either. The council convened within the hour, forced by law to hear formal testimony now that a champion had confessed sabotage in open ritual, under direct questioning, and faced with the certainty of execution for the crime of corrupting sacred combat. Fyodra broke completely, revealing that Casimir Drazul had approached her weeks earlier, around the exact time of the first, unexplained wolfsbane incident everyone had assumed was accidental exposure from tainted grain stores, offering her the position of court champion permanently, a position currently held, unofficially, by a rival she despised, if she would simply ensure that any servant trouble that arose was dealt with thoroughly and permanently. Boyar Casimir Drazul, cornered in front of 900 witnesses and a council no longer inclined toward patience, made his final error. He turned on Lady Zorana Krivaya, accusing her of having commissioned the original poisoning attempt against Branimir, months earlier, in a plot to weaken him enough that she could position her own bloodline, through a cousin with a legitimate claim, closer to the Volchia throne, while appearing, publicly, to be his devoted intended. Zorana's calm, ice-eyed composure finally cracked. She did not deny it outright. She simply said, loud enough for the front rows to hear, that a war slave with no bloodline had no right to have survived any of this, that some people were simply born to end up back in the river where they belonged. "How river rats end up back in the river," Yarina repeated, letting Zorana's own words from weeks earlier land across the silent arena. "You said that to me, when you thought I had no proof of anything. I have proof of everything now." She drew her father's pendant from beneath her collar and held it beside the identical mark now visible at Branimir's throat, and told the full council, in a voice that did not shake, the story her father had never lived to tell her completely. That 19 years ago, a Volchia noblewoman of the royal bloodline had secretly married a Drevoslavan battlefield healer against her family's wishes, sealing an alliance between the healer lines of Drevoslava and the royal blood of the Volchia pack with matching bone pendants carved by the same hand, an alliance Zorana's own family had spent 2 decades and 1 war trying to erase, first by murdering the Volchia noblewoman. The council's judgment was swift and absolute. Casimir Drazul was stripped of title and sentenced to exile beyond the Severa Mountains, forbidden ever to return under pain of death. Lady Zorana Krivaya, her family's decades-long conspiracy, exposed in front of 900 witnesses, was stripped of all noble standing and banished to the furthest northern holdings, her name struck from every record of the court. She had nearly ruled by murder. Feodra, for her confession, was spared execution, but permanently barred from ritual combat. Her career as champion ended by her own testimony. Voivode Branimir Kostrov stood before the full assembled pack, still pale from weeks of poisoning he had not fully understood until that hour, and removed Yarina's gray wool collar with his own hands, in front of every witness who had once called her river rat, war slave, and servant, declaring her, by the old law of matched bloodline pendants, not merely free, but recognized as Volchia nobility in her own right, the last living heir of an alliance his own mother had died protecting. "I did not choose you because you saved my life," he told her, close enough now that only she could hear it clearly over the roar of the crowd. "I choose you because you are the only person in 19 years who looked at what my mother built and decided it was worth finishing instead of burying." "That's 95% of this story closed," the poisoning explained, "the traitors named, the bloodline proven, and there's only one thing left before we're done here." In the weeks that followed, Yarina took up residence not as a servant but as the voivode's declared consort and the fortress's chief healer, her father's methods formally taught to the court physicians who had once dismissed them. Her collar burned in the same fire pit where Casimir Drazul's confiscated ledgers, proof of years of quiet embezzlement alongside his conspiracies, were also destroyed. Bogdan the groundskeeper was given a title he insisted, gruffly, he didn't want, and kept teaching stance work to anyone who asked, quietly proud in the way old soldiers rarely allow themselves to be. Feodra, stripped of her championship, chose exile alongside Zorana rather than face the daily reminder of her own confession, a small, sad footnote to a much larger reckoning. Yarina visited the unmarked grave where Drevoslavan war dead had been buried without ceremony, and, for the first time in 11 years, said her father's name aloud, somewhere that wasn't a whisper, meant to avoid punishment. She did not cry there either, but she stood a long time, pendant in her fist, and thought that survival, in the end, had never been about waiting quietly for someone to rescue her. It had been about staying alive long enough for the truth to finally have somewhere to land. If 11 years of being underestimated ever taught you anything about what you're actually capable of, once someone finally hands you the proof, you already understand exactly why Yarina never looked back at that collar burning in the fire pit. She was only ever looking forward, toward a throne that had been waiting, unknowingly, for the one person left alive who remembered what it was actually built to protect. And 3 nights after the council's judgment, a sealed letter arrived at the fortress gates, bearing a wax seal none of the current court recognized. A crescent moon, pierced by a single fang, pressed in ink, the exact color of old blood.